The Chukchi Sea lies between Alaska and Siberia, a shallow extension of the Arctic Ocean shaped by wind, current, and season. For much of the year, its surface is sealed by ice. In late summer, openings appear. By autumn, they close again. The transition is gradual, but decisive. Sea ice here does not form as a single sheet. It arrives in pieces. Flows drift, rotate, collide, and separate. Pressure ridges rise where slabs meet, stacking ice into uneven walls. Open leads appear briefly and vanish. The surface is never still. Even when it looks fixed, it is moving. Light changes quickly at this latitude. Days shorten. The sun remains low, casting long shadows across the ice. Visibility depends on weather more than time. Snowfall can erase contrast entirely, flattening depth and distance. Orientation becomes difficult without fixed reference points. Temperature alone does not define the environment. Wind determines exposure. A moderate breeze can strip heat rapidly. Metal stiffens. Wood contracts. Skin exposed for minutes can numb and fail. Sound carries far over ice, but direction is often misleading. There are no permanent settlements in this part of the Arctic Ocean. Any human presence depends on ships capable of leaving before freeze up or surviving after it. Once ice closes in, movement slows to the pace of the flows themselves. The sea does not announce when it becomes impassable. Routes that were open days earlier tighten without warning. A vessel can drift for weeks, carried by forces that cannot be resisted. Distance is measured not by progress, but by displacement. At first glance, the ice appears stable. It supports weight. It reflects light. It gives the impression of ground. But it is not land. It fractures under pressure and opens without sound. Its reliability changes by the hour. In 1913, this environment was already mapped, but not mastered. Expeditions moved through it with confidence, shaped by theory and ambition. The ice remained indifferent. It did not resist entry. It simply waited for conditions to change. The vessel at the center of the expedition was the Karluk, a former whaling ship purchased and refitted for Arctic service. Built in the late 19th century, it was constructed of wood reinforced for ice, but it was not designed to withstand prolonged pressure from heavy pack ice. By 1913, the ship had already seen years of hard use. The expedition was organized by Vilhjalmur Stefansson and formed part of the Canadian Arctic Expedition. Its goals were scientific and geopolitical. Researchers were tasked with mapping uncharted regions, studying Arctic wildlife, and strengthening Canadian claims in the high Arctic. The project combined exploration, research, and national ambition. The Karluk carried a mixed group of scientists, sailors, and specialists. Some were experienced in polar travel, others were not. The crew included geologists, biologists, meteorologists, and a small number of Inuit hunters whose knowledge of Arctic survival was critical but often undervalued in decision-making. Languages, expectations, and experience varied widely among those aboard. Preparations reflected confidence rather than caution. Stefansson believed that Arctic expeditions could rely heavily on hunting rather than extensive supply caches. This assumption shaped the amount of food carried and the emphasis placed on firearms and ammunition. While the ship was stocked for a long journey, margins were narrow. In July 1913, the Karluk sailed north from Alaska into the Chukchi Sea. Almost immediately, it encountered heavier ice than anticipated. Progress slowed. Leads closed behind the ship as quickly as they opened ahead. By August, the Karluk became trapped in pack ice, unable to maneuver free. Stefansson left the ship soon after, ostensibly to hunt caribou and secure additional food. He departed with a small party and did not return. Later accounts dispute his intentions, but the effect was clear. The ship's commanding authority was removed while the vessel remained icebound. Leadership passed to Captain Robert Bartlett, an experienced Arctic navigator. Bartlett understood the risks posed by the ice and recognized that the ship was drifting westward, carried by currents toward Siberia. Without power to escape, the Karluk became part of the ice itself. As months passed, the crew adjusted to the drift. Winter approached. Darkness increased. Supplies were rationed. The assumption that the ship could be freed before severe conditions set in became increasingly uncertain. At this stage, the expedition still existed as an organized entity. The ship remained intact. Authority was defined. But the structure that supported those assumptions, mobility, communication, and external support, was already eroding. The ice continued to close around the hull, indifferent to planning or purpose. By the early autumn of 1913, the Karluk was no longer a ship underway. It had become a fixed object embedded in moving ice. Pressure built gradually, announced by sound before damage became visible. The hull groaned as flows pressed inward. Timbers flexed and then settled. Each shift suggested that the ice was testing the structure, measuring its limits. The drift continued westward. Currents carried the ice pack toward Siberia at a slow but steady pace. The crew could not influence direction or speed. Navigation instruments recorded movement, but there was nowhere to steer. The ship's engine was intact, but the propeller was locked in ice. Power had no effect. Captain Robert Bartlett monitored the condition of the hull closely. He ordered supplies brought up from the hold and stored on deck in anticipation of possible abandonment. This was done gradually, without announcement. Panic would have served no purpose. The crew continued daily routines while contingency planning expanded quietly. As winter set in, the ice thickened. Leads that opened briefly refroze within hours. Pressure ridges formed around the ship, rising higher than the deck. Movement outside became difficult. Darkness lengthened. The temperature dropped well below freezing and remained there. In January 1914, the ice pressure increased sharply. Loud cracks echoed through the hull. Planks split. Seawater entered compartments despite pumps running continuously. The ship began to list. It was no longer a question of if the Karluk would be lost, but when. On January 10, the hull failed. Ice forced its way through the sides, crushing the wooden frame inward. The crew abandoned the ship in stages, carrying food, equipment, and personal belongings onto the ice. The Karluk sank slowly, its masts tilting before disappearing beneath the floes. What remained was a field of ice carrying people, supplies, and debris. The expedition's base no longer existed. Shelter was improvised using tents and salvaged materials. The ice beneath them continued to move, crack, and rearrange itself. The loss of the ship marked the true point of no return. Without it, there was no winter refuge, no engine, no fixed position. Survival depended on what could be carried by hand and what could be found ahead. The nearest land, Rangel Island, lay more than 80 miles away, across unstable ice. At this moment, the expedition's assumptions collapsed fully. The ice was no longer an obstacle to be navigated around. It was the ground beneath their feet, shifting constantly, offering no certainty of support. From here on, survival would require leaving the place where the ship had sunk and crossing a moving ocean frozen, just enough to walk on, an environment that could open without warning and close again just as quickly. After the loss of the Karluk, the ice became both ground and threat. The floe on which the survivors stood was several miles across, thick enough to bear weight but fractured by pressure ridges and leads of open water. It drifted continuously, its direction determined by wind and current rather than intention. Camp was established where the ice appeared most stable, though stability was temporary. Shelter was assembled from what had been salvaged. Tents were pitched and reinforced with snow blocks. Canvas was weighed down with ice and equipment. Cooking was done on small stoves when fuel allowed. Heat was conserved by limiting movement and crowding together at night. The environment offered no protection beyond what could be built quickly and repaired often. Supplies were inventoried and rationed. Food included pemmican, hardtack, flour, and tinned goods recovered from the ship. Ammunition was counted carefully. Hunting supplemented rations when seals or bears could be taken, but opportunities were unpredictable. Every decision was made with the expectation that replacement was unlikely. Daily routine emerged to impose order. Watches were kept to monitor cracks and leads forming near camp. Snow was melted for water. Equipment was repaired repeatedly. Sleds were constructed and adjusted in anticipation of travel. The goal was to prepare for movement without committing too early. Navigation posed a persistent problem. There were no fixed landmarks. The ice field changed shape as it drifted. Compass readings were affected by proximity to the magnetic pole and by local variation. Direction had to be estimated using the sun when visible and by tracking the general movement of the pack. When the decision was made to move toward land, progress was slow. Loads were heavy. Sleds snagged on ridges and slush. Leads opened unexpectedly, forcing detours or delays. At times, the group waited hours or days for refreezing before crossing. The ice dictated pace. Travel occurred in stages. Short distances were covered between rest points. Camps were rebuilt repeatedly. Fatigue accumulated. Frostbite affected hands and feet. Clothing stiffened and cracked. Repairs were constant. Discipline mattered. Overexertion increased risk of injury that could not be treated. Leadership emphasized restraint. Marching too long risked collapse. Moving too fast increased the chance of missing a lead opening behind them, cutting off retreat. The group balanced urgency against caution, knowing that hesitation also carried cost. Morale fluctuated with conditions. Clear weather allowed progress and orientation. Storms halted movement entirely, forcing the group to wait while tents shook under wind and snow. During these pauses, rations were stretched further. Conversation diminished. Focus narrowed to immediate tasks. Encounters with wildlife altered plans. Seals provided meat and fuel when taken successfully. Polar bears required vigilance and sometimes deterrence. Ammunition was expended only when necessary. Each shot carried long-term consequences. The ice itself fractured without warning. Sharp reports echoed as pressure built and released. Cracks widened into leads, then closed again under pressure. At times, the camp had to be relocated quickly to avoid being split. Equipment was lost occasionally when ice shifted faster than people could react. Despite these hazards, forward movement continued. Miles were measured not by distance covered, but by survival of each crossing. The group learned to read subtle changes in ice color and texture. Dark lines suggested thin ice. Raised ridges indicated compression and strength. Knowledge accumulated through exposure rather than instruction. Sleep was fragmented. Cold and noise interrupted rest. The body adjusted to a constant state of partial fatigue. Decisions were made conservatively, favoring survival over speed. The objective was to reach land, but not at the cost of losing members along the way. Over weeks, the environment did not soften. It changed continuously, but never became accommodating. The frozen sea remained an unstable platform, alternately passable and hostile. Progress occurred within narrow windows when conditions aligned. What sustained the group was not momentum, but persistence. Each day's movement was planned, executed, and then reassessed. There was no guarantee that the next lead could be crossed, or that the ice beneath them would hold through the night. Yet the routine continued. Break camp, haul loads, set shelter, wait. The crossing transformed the expedition. Scientific aims receded entirely. Survival became the sole metric. The frozen ocean, once an obstacle to navigation, was now the only route forward, a surface that demanded constant attention and offered no assurance beyond the moment underfoot. As the crossing continued, physical decline became unavoidable. Calorie intake fell below what the environment demanded. Even on days without movement, the body consumed energy simply to remain warm. Weight loss was visible across the group. Faces narrowed. Strength diminished. Tasks that had once been routine required planning and rest. Illness spread unevenly. Some men developed frostbite in fingers and toes, limiting dexterity. Others showed signs of malnutrition. Wounds healed slowly. Small injuries became disabling. Medical supplies were limited, and treatment options were restricted to rest, insulation, and restraint. Fatigue altered judgment. Disagreements emerged over pacing, route choice, and leadership decisions. The group fragmented temporarily as individuals or small parties argued for different approaches. These fractures were not dramatic, but cumulative, eroding cohesion over time. Several men attempted independent journeys across the ice, hoping to reach land faster or secure help. These efforts were poorly supported by conditions. Ice shifted unpredictably. Storms erased tracks. Some of those who left were never seen again. Their disappearance was not witnessed directly. Absence became confirmation. Deaths occurred gradually rather than in a single event. Some men collapsed from exhaustion and could not be revived. Others succumbed to exposure after falls into icy water weakened them beyond recovery. Each loss reduced manpower and increased the burden on those remaining. The psychological weight intensified. The ice crossing offered no milestones. Distance to land changed as the floes drifted. At times, progress made during a day was erased overnight. The knowledge that movement did not guarantee approach undermined morale. Leadership responded by narrowing objectives. The focus shifted from reaching land quickly to surviving each day intact. Loads were reduced by necessity. Non-essential equipment was abandoned. Rations were cut further. Decisions favored stability over ambition. Silence increased. Conversation diminished as energy was conserved. When speech occurred, it was practical. Emotional expression did not disappear, but it was contained. The environment imposed limits on attention and tolerance. Weather remained variable. Clear days allowed movement and orientation. Storms forced immobility, trapping the group in tents as snow accumulated. During these periods, the sense of isolation sharpened. The ice stretched uninterrupted in all directions, offering no sign of external presence. By the time land was finally sighted, the group was reduced in number and capacity. Survival had come at cost. The crossing had not been uniform or orderly. It had fractured under pressure, leaving only those able or willing to continue under diminishing conditions. The frozen sea did not preserve intention. It carried the survivors forward and backward without regard to effort. What remained were fewer people, weaker bodies, and a narrowing margin between endurance and collapse. Land first appeared as a low, dark line against the horizon. In the Arctic, distance is deceptive. What seems close can remain days away. The survivors did not celebrate when Wrangel Island came into view. They adjusted course and continued moving, aware that reaching land did not end exposure or guarantee safety. The final miles were among the most difficult. Ice near shore was broken and unstable, influenced by currents and changing tides. Leads opened frequently, floes tilted and shifted underfoot. Progress slowed further as caution replaced momentum. Each step was tested before weight was committed. When the group finally stepped onto Wrangel Island, the environment changed only slightly. The ice ended, but the cold did not. Wind swept across the tundra without obstruction. Snow lay unevenly across frozen ground. There was no shelter beyond what could be constructed from available materials. Camps were established using tents and salvaged equipment. Food supplies were critically low. Hunting resumed where possible, though success varied. Arctic foxes and birds provided occasional relief. Fuel remained scarce. Fires were rationed. The survivors adjusted to a new routine shaped by land rather than ice, but conditions remained severe. Captain Robert Bartlett recognized that remaining on the island without external assistance would lead to further losses. He decided to attempt a journey to seek rescue. Accompanied by an Inuit hunter, Kataktovik, Bartlett set out across the ice toward Siberia, a route longer and no less dangerous than the one already endured. Those left behind on Wrangel Island waited. The camp was maintained with care. Rations were stretched. Movement was limited to conserve energy. Weather dictated activity. The island did not provide immediate safety, only a temporary halt to drift. Bartlett's journey succeeded after weeks of travel and hardship. He reached the Siberian coast and eventually made contact with authorities. Rescue efforts were organized slowly, constrained by distance, ice, and limited vessels capable of reaching the island. In September 1914, a rescue ship arrived. Survivors were taken aboard without ceremony. Their condition reflected prolonged deprivation, thin, exhausted, and weakened. Medical care was basic, but sufficient to stabilize them. Names were checked. Losses were confirmed. The removal from Wrangel Island ended the expedition's survival phase. It did not resolve questions of responsibility or planning. It simply concluded the sequence of events that began with assumptions made far from the ice. The frozen sea had been crossed. Land had been reached. Survival had narrowed to those who endured long enough for external intervention to arrive. The Karluk Expedition entered the historical record as a failure of planning rather than a failure of endurance. Its scientific goals were largely unrealized. Its leadership structure fractured early. Its survival depended less on preparation than on adaptation after collapse. The frozen sea that carried the survivors toward Wrangel Island did not reward effort evenly. It erased distance, reversed progress, and separated individuals without warning. Those who survived did so within narrow margins, shaped by restraint, cooperation, and timing, rather than strength or intent. Responsibility for the expedition's outcome remained contested. Assumptions about Arctic self-sufficiency, promoted before departure, proved incompatible with the conditions encountered. Decisions made far from the ice carried consequences that could not be corrected once movement stopped. Captain Bartlett's actions during the crisis were later recognized as decisive. His insistence on discipline, rationing, and eventual travel for help contrasted with the expedition's initial optimism. Survival emerged not from theory, but from experience applied under constraint. In Arctic history, the Karluk stands as a record of what happens when movement becomes involuntary, and ground itself cannot be trusted. The survivors crossed miles of frozen ocean, not as an act of exploration, but because there was nowhere else to go. The ice closed again after they left. The routes they walked dissolved. What remains is the account.